Welcome to the Memebrarian. We're gonna be weird together. It's gonna be great. All my admins are on vacation, so it's just you and me. This is not at all gonna be a shit show at all. It's gonna be wonderful. If this is your first introduction to these videos, I am the Pagan Memebrarian. I'm the one who brings you all of that really exciting, ominous content that you get to read. I know we have like 10,000 new followers or something since we did these videos last a few months ago. So you may be new to our little story time with the Memebrarian. I get a lot of history questions and a lot of requests for book recommendations based on the history of the occult. And these videos are kind of a place where we can discuss how history relates to modern practice, and where I'm getting the commentary that you see on all of those memes. It is a place where I try not to like put my opinion out too much like I do on the page. So hopefully we can come here and like all learn something and have a cool theory to talk about. For those of you that are new to this, there is about a 1 minute lag time between when you guys type me a question and when I see it. So if you have questions as we are going through, feel free to post them now and I will try to answer them at the end. Or if there's like more information you want on something or another video you want to see, definitely let me know if there's something super interesting or cool that you want to talk about. Hit the like button, let me know you're actually watching this stuff, so that I know you want to make more of these. We used to do Q&A, but we got a lot of questions about like penguins and paleontology and stuff I know nothing about. So I think we're just gonna stick to the videos for right now. And I will try to get to like all of your cool stuff at the end. I'm going to post this later on the page, so if you miss something, you can go back to it. If you want to see a book that I recommend, you can freeze frame it. If you come up with a question that you didn't think of while we were doing it, you can definitely post it then. But today we're going to talk about Bloodline Witch Theory and primarily how it is revealed in the Book of Enoch. Don't get upset, pagans. This is academic. We're going to talk about this book as a text which influenced our view of bloodline witches and culture and how exciting and pervasive this theory is. It's not about proselytization. This is indeed going to be a history lesson. I decided on this topic because recently I've become in charge of wrangling a new group of pagans. They're mostly young women. They're an awesome bunch, and they're reading, which is fantastic. Mostly they're reading fantasy fiction, which is great. I mean, I'm super hopeful that this is going to lead to questions and more academic research and get them into physics and botany and genetics and a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today. I read fiction as an addendum to textbooks and source material and the things I translate, because fiction is the mythos of our time. It really is the narrative that we're going to be, or people are going to be using in the future to say these are the stories that we told while we were alive, just like we look at older mythos from thousands of years ago and retell those stories today. The things we write today, these videos are our source material. You hear me talk a lot on the page about source material, and that can be kind of confusing if you're not researching the stuff in a very specific scholarly way. Source material is very specifically material that was created during the time and the place that we're talking about. This is not conjecture. This is not someone's interpretation of things. This is actual, evidence of what was happening in a specific time and place. And that's our best material to know about history. To understand it not through somebody else's eyes, but in the way that it actually happened. I love art as a form of source material. It holds up better than manuscripts, even though manuscripts are crazy important, especially architecture, because it is so big, because it is so massive, because it is made of stone. It's really something that we can look at. Also, art is something that can be viewed cross-continentally. when compared as a whole in a specific time frame. So it can give you like a very clear picture of how things evolved over and throughout the world and what was a pervasive theme despite what may have been going on individually in certain continents or countries. But my current group is reading about witches, which has led to some really cool modern questions and some really cool ancient questions about types of witches. I think this is really the beginning to that like kind of path of learning about like the esotericism of the occult. Since time immemorable, there have been lots of different types of witches. There were sorcerers, conjurers, necromancers, divinators, healers, casters, alchemists. I mean, the list goes on forever. It's one of the things that makes this topic so exciting. And I think we have this tendency in modern literature and modern mythos to put all of these different types of practitioners into two different categories in a really simplistic view. The white witch or the black magic practitioner. Those who practice from the right hand being good, or those who practice from the left hand being bad. And this theory can coincide with all of these other different types of practitioners that we just listed, but dividing things into black and white and good and bad is inherently problematic. I mean, the world is in shades of color. Diversity is what makes us amazing. Putting things in black and white is what helped wars start. I mean, we learned this, right? So it's important that we see the world in these shades of color. In fact, black and white in itself is a modern concept, which was really started by the Byzantine cathedral builders when they associated light with God and goodness. This went all the way into today, but was really highlighted by the Gothic builders, who were putting so much glass into churches that they ended up having to put support beams on the outside of them. And we see this in like the flying buttresses outside of the Notre Dame de Paris, because there was just so much weight in this glass because they placed so much importance in light that there wasn't any wall space to literally hold it up. I mean, this is a very good example of how equating good and bad as absolutes and light and darkness with this sort of thing came out to have these really ill effects. And it came out in architecture, but it's a good lesson that I think that we can apply to just generalizing the occult. Before this, we still saw colors distinguishing witches, but the spectrum was different. It was green witches, blue witches, red witches. We're in the middle of the holidays. These colors should sound pretty familiar to you. That's a theory we can talk about later if you'd like. But it was definitely a more colorful world when we were dividing these types of witches up. And we're going to talk about, like, real briefly, some of these other types of witches before we get to our bloodline witches. Because there's a huge difference. Green witches, who you hear talked about in European literature as cunning folk or like the women of the woods, were primarily botanists and healers. This was a craft that was learned. With the right tutelage, anyone could take this up. Sometimes and quite often it was indeed passed down through families, a mother teaching a daughter, or a grandmother teaching a granddaughter, mother teaching niece, whatever. Midwives were considered green. They would have been the only town doctors, and they would have used herbs and oral knowledges to help their villages, to help their cities. These were the original green witches, and that's a really important thing to remember, because if we think about prostitution being the oldest profession in the world, we really have to assume the second oldest is midwifery, right? And that's the green witches out there. These midwives were often chased out as witches, as a matter of fact, especially before the advent of modern medicine as we know it, because they directly opposed the theories that doctors at the time were promoting up until even the early 19th century of balancing the humors because they were so interested in all of this green stuff that you see behind me, all of this herbage, all of these tinctures and stuff that you see behind me, the stuff that directly came from the woods. But it's important to know that, like doctors, these people were trained. They were taught by other people. This was not something that was inherently born into them through a bloodline, through genetics. Blue witches are a little different, not to be confused with the blue people of Appalachia. This is kind of our middle ground witch. This is a birthright and not a blood right. And that distinguishing those two things is really important to the conversation we're going to have about bloodline witches. Blue witches were people who were born blue or with a caul. Being born blue means that you were born usually deprived of oxygen, so your coloring would be a little bit blue because you weren't breathing correctly. Or with a caul, which is where usually it's over the face, which is where part of the amniotic sac has not been completely removed during the birth, so you kind of have this layer of skin over you that looks sort of like a veil. People born like this were believed for a very, very long time to have a connection with the other realms. They were believed to have the sight. This was not just in terms of the foresight. Well, I mean, they were believed to have foresight, but also that they might have dreamt true, or that their dreams might have been omens or indicators of what was to come, but also that they were involved in some sort of necromancy or capable of some sort of necromancy. And we all know that necromancy at its heart isn't about raising the dead, it's about communicating with the dead. These people, because they were born blue people, because they were born a little bit closer to maybe that death or that other realm, were believed to be closer connected to it in life. And these are we are looking at as our blue witches. But once again, this is something, yes, that you are born with, but it is not something that's genetic. So it's therefore, yes, a birthright, but it's not necessarily something that's in your bloodline. This is not something that's genetically passed down. And then we get to our red witches, and these really are our bloodline witches. And this is what we're here to talk about today, and we're going to talk about it in terms of Enoch. This is the idea that witchcraft is a talent or a gift passed down, usually through the matrilineal line at birth. Or not. I mean, you know, sometimes it skips a generation or whatever. This is really like the cryptid version of witchcraft, which is kind of cool. It's saying that witches are, on a genetic level, different than other people, that they hold something inside of their blood that was passed down to them by their families, specifically by the women in their families, that made them more capable of affecting change upon the world around them or affecting people around them. It was something that was really inherently given to them at birth. And we hear these theories, and I think a lot of people, some people, you know, shrug them off, and some people believe really deeply about them, and that what you believe is totally up to you. I'm not going to argue about that. It's a theory, but it is a really exciting one. But if you're in that first camp, you might be asking yourself, you know, why women and why genetics? And it's really likely that this belief traces way back to the oldest ideas of a female, not just deity, but a female godhead. Meaning that the female was, in fact, not just one of the gods, but the god, as we think of, you know, Helios being the highest of the gods, or Zeus being the highest of the gods, or Ra being the highest of the gods. And this belief traces back to the Orishas in West Africa, to the Queen of the Heavens in Europe, to the moon worshippers of the Western continents. Really, we see this cross-continentally all over the place, this kind of female godhead worship. We see it all the way back into the Venus statues that were found from the Paleolithic era. This means that before even the advent of agriculture, we were already seeing images of a goddess who was a female figure. Now, we have to ask ourselves why we saw this, and I think in order to understand that, we really have to get into the heads of early people and what their first questions would have been about the world. And their first question, really, most likely, and this is conjecture, but I think it's pretty solid conjecture and pretty well agreed upon conjecture, that their first question would have been how. How was the world created? How did people get here? How were we made? How was everything around us made? And it's pretty natural to, if we know how babies are born, to assume that people in general were born, and that they were born of a female god. And therefore it goes along that line of reasoning to believe that the earth was also born in a similar fashion. I'm not knocking anyone's religion here. Believe what you want to believe in what gods you want to believe. But this is definitely an idea that we see in art all the way back. And the cool thing about it is that this idea remains persistent, even until today, that there's some sort of birthright. We see it in our fiction of today. Alice Hoffman, who writes the Practical Magic series, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, writes almost exclusively about bloodline witches and families. Louisa Morgan writes about bloodline witches. J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter is even writing about bloodlines, right? These are through families. We see it in shows. We see it in Bewitched. We see it in Charmed. They all have this kind of genetic element. We even see it in history. We saw it in the witch trials in the U.S., but primarily in the witch trials in Europe in the 1600s. The women who were being hung, burned, ducked, whatever, as witches they were women mostly. There were some men, but mostly women. Daughters were associated with mothers. If your mother was a witch, you were under scrutiny as well. And a really interesting thing that I think we don't talk about a lot, but we're going to talk about today, is that this was especially true among Catholic women. A lot of these women who were burned were primarily Catholic. They weren't the Protestants. They weren't of the Church of England. And this wasn't just about a feud between Elizabeth I and Mary over religion and the throne and all of that kind of history that we usually get. We have to think about the position that these women were in. We hear a lot about Huguenots fleeing to other countries to kind of get away from persecution during these times. But we have to understand that women likely did not have jobs that allowed them to flee. They were not often literate, so it wasn't as easy for them to flee. They were the ones kind of stuck in their hometowns, just continuing to do what they did. And Catholic women muttering prayers for miracles in Latin instead of the Queen's English seemed a lot like spellcasters. If these prayers came true, that seemed a lot like magic. It was a hard time not just for women, but for Catholic women specifically. And I think that that's where we're going to look at the Book of Enoch, and we're going to look at kind of some Catholic texts to sort of understand where that idea comes from and why it's so pervasive even today in the literature that we see today, even though it's not related to religion in that way. We really see the outline for this in the Book of Enoch. This is my copy of the Book of Enoch. You can buy a big fat copy of all of these kind of texts. I prefer this one. It was compiled and edited by Ronald Brown. He is a Baptist, but he is a PhD in religious studies, and I think this is an excellent translation. It's the one I prefer. It's the best translation I found before, and I've read a few compendiums as well as some individual versions, but this is the one that I like to use and refer to. You might be asking yourself right now, if you are familiar with canon, why have I never heard of the Book of Enoch? I mean, I hear the Pagan Memebrarian talk about it a lot, but other than that, I've never heard anyone in my life talk about that. And that's because it's not currently in canon. It's not currently in the Bible. You are never going to reach into your hotel drawer and find the Book of Enoch here in your little red Gideon book. That is actually a book that was from a hotel. We won't explain how I got it. And the reason it's not in canon today has a lot to do with some things that were set in motion about the year 300 under the rule of Constantine. Constantine started in 324 and went a little bit later than that, really trying to create some sort of solidarity in the church. We've heard about the Council of Nicaea. We've heard about kind of some of these big things that he did, but realistically what Constantine was trying to do was create a single catechism. He was trying to create a single dogma that was cohesive for Christianity as a whole, so that everybody that read Christianity was kind of on the same page. Because we have to understand, word didn't travel as quickly back then, and people had a lot of different beliefs. This meant that we lost some of the books in canon. One of the books that we lost was the Book of Enoch. I mean, it's not lost, it's sitting in my lap right now. We're going to read from it, story time here in a minute. But not every book that was in every Bible ended up in your King James Version or your New American Standard. And a big reason for that was one that we wanted Constantine wanted a Bible that was a cohesive story that could be read cover to cover, but also it had a lot to do with how books were made back before the invention of the modern printing press. The Bible itself would have been one of the most popular books to have made. We have to think that books were really, really expensive, and this was a time of censorship. So if you were going to commission a book to be made, it would very likely be the Bible. Books then were written by hand. They were illuminated or illustrated by hand. This was done primarily by monks in monasteries who devoted their whole lives to this. And each monk worked off of the Bible of their monastery, meaning that, there was a guy who just did the little illuminated pictures inside each Bible that he was copying from the monastery's Bible. There was a guy who just wrote the words. There was a guy who just did the binding. This took a lot of people. It was an extensive process and it took a lot of time. You've probably kind of heard some stories about this, and the Beatus manuscripts being some of the most famous books, and the Book of Kells being one of the most famous books. But these books are drastically different because stories were told differently from country to country. Each monastery's version of the Bible would have been a different version of the Bible. So the Bible you commissioned in Germany might be very, very different from the Bible that you commissioned in France, because they were made by two different monasteries. The interesting thing, I think, to me, and that should be interesting to all of us, is that some things in canon still hint at this book. They still hint at the Book of Enoch. From the very, very, very beginning in the book of Genesis, we hear about the first family. We hear about Adam and Eve and their three sons. Primarily, we hear about their first two sons, Cain and Abel. If you've heard the story, it doesn't work out so great. Cain kills his brother Abel. That didn't go over well. So Cain ran away, and he ran away to a city called Canaan, which is something that I think is overlooked a lot, but is crazy interesting to me. we hear about God made these two people. You know, if you're from different Abrahamic religions, you maybe heard your rabbi tell the story about a third lady named Lilith. We won't talk about her. We'll talk about her later. Another video for another time. But, you know, we really just have this group of 4 people, and then all of a sudden one of them dies and one of them runs away. He goes out into the desert, and poof, there is a whole nother city there, a thriving city full of people. Where did all of these people come from? Nobody really ever asks or answers this question in the Bible in canonical text. But it's certainly there. I mean, Cain runs to Canaan. So how did it get there? And how did that happen? And who was living in this city? These are some really important questions that, and Enoch tells us. He explains it all to us, which is crazy interesting as if we take it as an academic, popular story of the time period in which it was written and in time periods in which it was read. Enoch jumps right in. He is not shy about this at all, especially if we consider that the first 4 chapters are a little more, I mean, they can barely be considered paragraphs, really. He starts in the very, very beginning in chapter 6, telling us exactly how Canaan is invented. Basically, before the deluge, which is also in the book of Genesis, before the story of Noah, we hear that some angels come to earth. This starts in chapter 6, verse 2. And story time is about to start, if you haven't noticed. With the angels, the children of heaven saw and lusted after them, those are the people of Canaan, and said to one another, "Come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men and get us children." So really, as soon as the city is created, the angels are kind of coming down and taking wives out of it. And then it immediately tells us how the angels treat these women, and that's to really teach us witchcraft. By chapter 7, in verse 1, and they taught them charms and enchantments and cutting of roots and made them acquainted with plants. That's that, you know, green witchcraft we were just talking about. By chapter 8, we see it even more specifically with they taught them enchantments and root cuttings, the resolving of enchantments, astrology, the constellation, the knowledge of the clouds, signs of the earth, the signs of the suns, and the course of the moon. I mean, this is all stuff that even today we're associating with witchcraft. They're not coming right out and saying it, but this is in these chapters. But this really is the stuff that we today are saying, hey, this is witchcraft. This is part of our practice. This is part of our trade. And wow, isn't it crazy? It's written down in canon how it happened. So the angels have come down, basically, from heaven. They have found themselves some women that they find hot and sexy. They've gotten it on. They've taught them some witchcraft. And then we get the result of this, which is the Nephilim, which are the children of the women. We see in chapter 15, verse 3. Where have ye left the high, holy, and eternal heaven, laden with women, and defiled yourselves with the daughters of men, and taken to yourselves wives, and done like the children of earth, and begotten giants as your son? And though you were holy, spiritual, and living eternal life, you have defiled yourselves with the blood of women, and have begotten children with the blood of flesh. So, realistically, and we can use the word giants kind of loosely here, this does not necessarily mean that these people were ogres. I think there's been some argument that giant just means people over 6 feet tall, but also the word could be translated to mean something a little bit more spectacular, just that they were great people. And God has an immediate reaction in verse 5. In fact, what he does is he gives men wives. So we can kind of assume that before the Nephilim went down and mated with the women, men weren't doing it. Common mortal men weren't doing it. Chapter 5 says here, and from God, therefore I have given them wives also, that they might impregnate them and beget children by them, and thus nothing might be wanting them on earth. So he's trying to satisfy these men. But we still have these children. We still have these children that are the result of this sort of diverse relationship between angels and women. They're called Nephilim. And they remain, but they do become very much demonized. We can see in verse 8, and now the giants who are produced from the spirits and flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling. So immediately these people that have learned witchcraft become kind of demonized, and we can talk more about the story of Lilith, which is an Abrahamic story, and how she immediately becomes demonized in the same sort of way. But it's very, very interesting. It also might be argued that this is the beginning of vampirism. In verse 11, but that's maybe something else we'll get into. They take no food, but nevertheless hunger and thirst and cause offenses. And these spirits shall rise up against the children of men and against women, because they have proceeded from them. I mean, how much more demonizing can you get, really? And very, very specifically then in chapter 16, it goes on to say that these traits were specifically passed down to the women. Chapter 16, verse 3, you have been in heaven, but all the mysteries have not yet been revealed to you, and you knew worthless ones. And these in the hardness of your hearts you have made known to women. And through these mysteries, women and men work much evil on earth. That's pretty specific. That it is passed down to the women, and the women are the ones that are going to carry this knowledge. So we know that there are now these sort of children that are made through these interracial kind of relationships, but realistically we are saying outright this is passed through the women. And if that is not clear enough, by chapter 19, the women have become sirens, and the women of the angels who want to stray become sirens. That's verse 2 of chapter 19. That we are sort of the creators and the destroyers, which is a very, very interesting role that women play throughout time, but is especially interesting when we apply this to women who are now the bearers of witchcraft. You might be wondering, what happens to a Nephilim? It's really, really interesting. By chapter 22, we are reading that the Nephilim don't go to judgment in Revelation. We know that at the end of time, from the Book of Revelation in canon, that men and women are going to be judged. And the angels are going to be a part of that, but we haven't really heard in canon anything about what's going to happen to the Nephilim, who are these creatures which are made of this sort of biracial, or I don't know, by being creatures. But we do hear that they're not going to be a part of this. Chapter 22, verse 13. Such has been made for the spirits of men who are not righteous but sinners, who were complete in transgression, and of the transgressors they shall be companions, but their spirits shall not be slain in the day of judgment, nor shall they be raised thence. This is really, really important if we're thinking about this book in relation to the Bible we know today. Because we don't hear a lot in the Bible about who is and who isn't going into heaven among the people. In fact, we only hear it once. We hear it in the Book of Revelations. It is all the way in Revelations chapter 22, verse 15. This is literally the last page of the book. And we hear, but outside are dogs and sorcerers and sexually immoral and murderers and idolaters and whoever loves and practices a lie. It's important that in that list is sorcerers. This really reaffirms in canon specifically that these beings, the Nephilim, are witches. They are indeed practitioners like ourselves. They've taken the skills that they've learned. They've taken those bloodline traits that they inherited through their mothers, and therefore are not being allowed into either heaven or hell. We joke a lot on this page about heaven or hell really not being a place for any of us. I think we have a lot of jokes and memes about, I don't want to go to heaven because it really does not sound like a cool place for me. This hell thing does sound more like where all the cool people are, but, in the back of our heads, we're all thinking, are there going to be carbs? And that's really, really interesting because it's actually not the place for us according to these Abrahamic texts. We're not going to go there. In fact, we're going to sit outside. We're not going to heaven. We're not going to hell. We are a different sort, especially these bloodline witches that we're talking about. And they're not going to go to other places. And this really doesn't have to do with people in general. This does not have to do with the cunning women. This does not have to do with just women. In fact, we hear women still associated with hell by chapter 54. Chapter 54, verse 8 of Enoch. That which is above the heavens is the masculine, and the water which is beneath the earth is feminine. Okay, yeah. Whoa, misogyny. Take a deep breath. Let's move forward. What we're really saying here is that the problem is not, we're not being kept out of hell because we're women and women pass down this sin. We're being kept out of hell because of this bloodline sort of witchcraft, which is really, really a very interesting thing, that genetically we are just not made for either place. So we know that Enoch was a predecessor of Noah. In fact, I think he was his great-grandfather or great-grandfather or some such thing. We talk about Noah later on in this book. And we know in the story of the Great Flood that all the sinners are killed so that the earth can be cleansed. And this is very, very interesting because the wording is mostly about people. And we've already established in the Book of Enoch that witches are not necessarily people. In fact, they don't go where people go at Revelation. They aren't made of the same things people are made of. So what happens to the Nephilim exactly? What happens to these bloodline witches? Are they included in the groups of people that are killed in this flood? Excellent question, Memebrarian. I'm glad you asked. Enoch has an answer for you. Has an answer for all of us. He is very, very, very specific about it in chapter 65. It's a quite long sentence, where he says witches, alchemists, sorcerers, all of them live until Revelations. In 65:6, and command has gone forth from the presence of the Lord concerning those who dwell on the earth, that their ruin is accomplished, because they have learnt all the secrets of the angels, and all violence of the Satans, and their powers, the most secret ones, and the power of those who practice sorcery, and the power of witchcraft, and the power of those who make molten images from the earth. I mean, this is like really super interesting stuff. Because of the by 65:10, we read that they're actually the reason for the apocalypse. Sorry, hate to tell you. Enoch says witches bring down the end of time. 65:10. Because of the sorceries which they have searched out and learnt, the earth and those who dwell upon it shall be destroyed. He's pretty clear. It's the bloodline witches' fault. I don't think you'd be much clearer of it, because of the sorceries and which they have searched out and learnt, the earth and those who dwell upon it shall be destroyed. Well, let's take responsibility for our actions. But I think that there is a more important message here. Oh god, I've kicked my camera. This is what happens when I don't have admins in the room. Let me kick my camera. it's important when we're reading a book, any book, that we're not just taking it at face value, that we're not just reading it and going, okay, well, that was some misogynistic bullshit, but that we really are asking questions about not just, you know, why this book is not our book, or that we go a step further and we ask, you know, what is missing from this book, that we extrapolate the missing data, that we find out, you know, why this book says the things it says, why the timeline is a little bit strange. But even beyond that, that we're asking questions about what these things mean. And that we're asking questions that aren't necessarily answered in these books. This is what good scientists do. This is what good archaeologists do. They ask the questions that aren't presented to us. For those of us that were brought up in Christianity or other Abrahamic religions, I think that there was a tendency to be taught that we were all sons of Adam. Therefore, we're all mortal and we're all born with original sin. And that's just, if we look at the Book of Enoch, really not the case, right? Because if some of the Nephilim survive the deluge of Noah, that means that there are still people, which the story tells us that they do, right? We just read the story. Well, we read some excerpts from it. It's a long book. Sorry, we don't have that long. But that there are still people out there with divine blood and genetic knowledge of witchcraft. This means that we are not all born with original sin on us, which is why we're not going to heaven or hell, because heaven or hell were places created for people with sins. But it also means that there are people with this sort of God blood inside of them. Not to say that they're specifically demigods, but there are still people out there, descendants of the Nephilim, who have some sort of angelic thing inside of them that makes them special, that makes them different, that makes them weird. My favorite word, you all know it's pinned to the top of the page. That gives them this different power. And this is really just confirmed over and over and over again in Enoch with the ideas of heaven and hell. This is a question that we really have to relate to ourselves. If the first mention of this is in the book of Genesis, and where we learn about original sin, and then the last book we hear about this in is Revelation, where we're talking about heaven and hell, this is something that a child of divine blood would not have. Furthermore, it means that it's a genetic trait, and it's a genetic trait that's passed down through women, meaning it's encoded in the double X chromosome, which makes it, I'm going to go science nerd on you, it makes it a recessive gene. Hey guys, guess what? That explains why it skips a generation every now and then. This just has mind-boggling implications to me. Science meet religion. Religion meets science, shake hands. I know it doesn't happen often. We try and keep the two separate. But this is really, really exciting to think about witchcraft not just as a religion, or not just as a practice, or not just as a way of life, but as something that might be genetically encoded within certain people. That doesn't make people who learn green magic any less of a witch. It doesn't mean this theory is true. But it is a pervasive theory that has been passed down for a really, really, really long time, and is even supported in the pop culture of today, as we talked about earlier in the video. And it makes it, and that it is a theory that can be supported by, well, not supported by, but can be kind of extrapolated in scientific terms now that we've mapped the human genome and kind of understand how genes and recessive traits work. So I really encourage you guys to read up on this. I encourage you guys to come up with your own theories on this, to ask your own questions on this, have your own, assertions. I would love to hear them. I would love to hear what your questions are regarding this. I know I did not cite a ton of sources during this, and I will give you some books now if you want to know what to read, if you want to know kind of where we're talking about this history from. A little bit of, this book is a little outdated on the info about the transformation from the female godhead in the matrilineal system to the patriarchy. It's called When God Was a Woman, written by Merlin Stone, which I'm sure is a pseudonym. But it is a great reference and has some really awesome insights on the female advents of agriculture, math, literature, religion, and all of that kind of during the Neolithic era. They do a really, really, really good job of tracking the female deity throughout time. We now, in the 90s, with kind of our research into Cantal Hayuk, know that not all of this was true. Some of those goddesses were actually hermaphroditic, but it does have some great insights. One of my other favorite books on how women became villainized as witches throughout art history. This is an older book. It's one that I've had since, I don't know, dinosaurs roamed the earth. It's called The Painted Witch. It's by Edward Mullins. This is a fantastic book that discusses the purpose of women throughout art history. There are some illustrations in here that really go through the roles that women play in art and how that reflects on society as a whole. And what we're seeing there. If you are not into heavy reading, you like a lot of pictures, a great book about the female godhead and how it transforms into artistic depictions again throughout time, and her specific roles is Manuela de Mesquite's The Song of Eve. This is a fantastic book. It is full color illustrations, as you can see. There is a lot of information in here. But it is just really if you like fine art, it is a great source of that, and it divides it up, as you can see, by the roles that women played. So if you're interested in a specific role, like, you know, the role of mother, or the archetype of Medea, or, you know, the women of the sea, or that sort of thing, you can flip right through it to find something. If you are interested in how Constantine changed architecture and the theory behind this, or depictions of biblical manuscripts, pre-machine printed Bibles of today, a great textbook on this is Marilyn Stokes' Medieval Art. This is a textbook, I'm not going to lie to you, this is heavy reading, but it is an excellent read, especially if you're interested in kind of the history of that particular historical event. My favorite book ever, which is super heavy, so excuse me that I'm off camera, the whole history of art and architecture, and because we know the Godhead was really important, so the history also of the Godhead from the Paleolithic era all the way into early 20th century modern art is going to be gardener's art throughout the ages. I think this is a book that everybody should have a copy of, or at least you should check it out from the library until they won't let you check it out anymore. It's hefty, it's thick, but it has great references in it, and it has great full color illustrations in it. We talked about some of those early Christian manuscripts and versions of the Bible. It has pictures of the Lindisfarne Gospels out of Northumbria, which is England. It has great pictures of the Book of Kells, the Illuminations, which came out of Scotland. And like I said, the Utrecht Psalter, which came out of France, is here under my hands, if you can see it. And this goes all the way into those more modern depictions of the Bible after Constantine, like this Give Us from Germany, which was printed in 1179. You can see we're getting a little more colorful in our imagery there, as well as where we're talking about the great cathedrals built once light was equated with goodness, and that's kind of discussed. This is the Cathedral of Chartres in France, which was built in 1194, as well as those flying buttresses from 1200 in Notre Dame de Paris. This is really, really the compendium. And I'm sorry, I'm off camera again. This is what happens when my admins go on vacation. I'm lost without them. This is really, really a great compendium of all of those things. If you're looking for source material and you don't know where to look, art is a great place to look because it will answer questions for you that you did not know that you had and create more. If you would like information on modern blue people and seers, especially cunning folk in the Americas, more specifically cunning folk in Appalachia. Here, I know a lot of my viewers are in the States. Southern Cunning by Oberon is, you know, decent. I'll give you an overview. Richards has a great one called Backwoods Witchcraft, which I often introduce to people who are interested in kind of the Southern Appalachian granny magic. But there's a very firm belief there in the seers that are born blue that we can read about. Some of the authors that we mentioned at the beginning of the video, if you're into fiction and bloodline witches, are, of course, Amy McKay. She writes great historical fiction. She writes about bloodline witches, but she has lots of scholarly citations she'll put in, you know, little newspaper clippings and things like that from the time that are actually very accurate. She tends to write them around historical events that actually happened. So it's very interesting. It is still fiction, but you're going to get a little bit more of a historical perspective. And she's just, I mean, she really is great into her citations. Louisa Morgan, I think she's written only 3 books, but she writes exclusively about bloodline witches. And of course, some really popular modern fiction. We're going to talk about Alice Hoffman, who I think I have over a dozen books behind me of hers, who writes a lot about bloodline witches. In fact, her latest and last book in the Practical Magic series, which is the Book of Magic that just came out this last October, deals almost exclusively with the difference between green and red witches. She doesn't mention blue people, but she does kind of deal with that difference, and she does write a lot about bloodline magic. I will give you a bit of a warning. I know I'm sitting in front of an apothecary. I would not take Alice Hoffman's advice on herbalism seriously. She does some great work. She's a magical writer. But the plants she talks about using, whether intentionally or not, she will not tell you what are poisonous or not. I think at some point she says yarrow is poisonous, which it's not, and she talks about killing someone slowly with belladonna in the first book, which would really kill you instantaneously. She's talking about another plant there, one which I won't mention because I don't want to go to jail. But Alice Hoffman does write fantastic books, especially if you're interested in, if you like to read a love story when you're in your free time. So basically we've taken you from the Paleolithic era of bloodline, which is primarily focusing on Enoch, all the way down to, you know, our modern practical magic and fiction, or our modern mythos. That's about all I have. I think I'm taking up like a ton of your time. If you all have questions, and I mentioned in the beginning of the video, but we have some new viewers on with us. Ask them now. There's about a minute of lag time left. So start typing if you have anything that you would like me to see. And I will try to answer them if there's anything I didn't cover. I know I talk really, really fast as I try to get all of this stuff done. Also, like the video if you want to see more of them. It's how we know what to post. It's how we know whether or not you're watching these videos. It's how we know to stop doing Q&A. Let me, if you want further, if there's something you think of later, we're going to post this to the page so that you can watch it, or if you want to see those book recommendations not put up quite so fast, you can pause the video, you can comment or ask questions then. Kind of scrolling through what you just said. Of course, I closed my laptop in the middle of that, so I'm doing it on my phone. Yay. It's fine. It's fine. Total shit show. Have you heard the Irish story of the birth of Lladra and Cessair, the other arc? I have not heard the Irish story of this. I would love to hear the Irish story of this. Feel free to, you can message me on the page. Let me know about it. I know that the older stories that are told in Judaic religions about Noah are slightly different than the ones that we're hearing in Torah, just like the creation stories that we hear from rabbis. We mentioned, glossed over Lilith a few times. That's not in Torah. That's a story rabbis tell to reconcile the two creation stories in the beginning of Genesis. But the story of Noah does vary in those Judaic religions. In fact, we hear about unicorns and other cool stuff in it that's not in the Bible. And I know there is a South American version of it as well, where a family escapes into the mountains. I think the story of the Great Flood is very archetypal, so we hear about that cross-continentally from a lot of different places, and all the stories are so interesting to me. I'm very much a universalist pagan. I think a lot of these stories are archetypal. We hear them over and over and over again, and that's what makes them so important, because they're kind of an inner part of us. I'm trying to read through your comments. Thank you for that. I do enjoy my cup. I like to drink out of cups that say things Facebook won't let me say online. Reincarnation is better than hanging outside with the Nephilim. Unless you're reincarnated as a worm, I guess. I like that. I'm not going to either. I like that too. I don't think I want to go to either. My cup's kind of a thing. Elohim was the Canaanite god of Saturn. It was people adopted. There's so much weird symbolism around Saturn. For the example, there's a lot going on with Saturn. I'm not sure how that relates to Elohim, but Greek literature is something else that I study quite a lot of. So if that's something you guys are interested in, you can let me know. Let me know in the comments what type of Greek deities or theurgy or whatever you're interested in. Theurgy is one of my favorite things to study. I keep a copy of the PGM next to the bed. I read constantly. Love the Homeric oracles. I love the Gnostic texts too, Zach. I look so mystical. Oh, thank you. I feel like the female Indiana Jones in this outfit. This is not a setup, just FYI. I'm trying to read your name really small on my phone. I think it's Ravine Augustine. This is not a setup. This is literally my library. On the other side of me is just shelves and shelves of books. Actually, I'm surrounded by shelves and shelves of books. I won't pan you around the room because I'm on a tripod, but this is just legitimately my apothecary. This is a permanent part of my house. It was not staged. I won't lie to you. I live and breathe as a weirdo. Who you see on the page is who I actually am. I don't have just a wall of weird witchy things. My whole house is like this. I'm weird all the way. I'm both feet into weirdness. But I appreciate it. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed all of my silly jars. Well, they're not silly. I like to feed them to my friends when they're not looking. Women are magic. How do they do that? I don't know. I think it's magic too. Constantly in awe of all of us, really. Oh, Damien, that's sweet. I'm really appreciative of these sessions and your knack of summarizing complex subjects and history into a few words. Thank you for sharing this. Well, thank you for coming. I do appreciate you guys. You keep me going. You really do. You guys are the sustaining force on this page. Without you, without your group shares, without your likes, this page would definitely not keep going. You guys are the driving thing behind it, and I love you all. Thanks, Lindsay. I'm glad you're enjoying the page. I love you too. I'm happy. Oh, Mauricio, I'm happy you're here too. I think I made it. Oh my gosh, did I make it to the bottom of the comments already? I think I did. That's magical. I never make it all the way through them. Oh, that's a little hard. I believe it's not in the Bible because it doesn't fit the conventional narrative, but very much in the Dead Sea Scrolls, though, and then my Seymour button, though cherry picked through. I would agree with you. I think that the Book of Enoch is not contained in the Bible for very specific reasons. And there are reasons that we didn't touch on today. We focused mostly on Bloodline Witchcraft in the Book of Enoch, but there are some very, very specific things having to do with Sheol and Purgatory, which later became a part of Catechism, but were not a part of canon. As well as some lineage things in here. And there is a lot of information about the angels, especially the archangels, that does not fit in with what is in with canon. And I think that this was left out for very important reasons, because it did not fit into the biblical text. However, when we take out Enoch, it raises a lot of questions, not just those questions about witches and not just the questions about, where Canaan came from. But there also seem to be some very physical questions about the timeline in the Bible that arise when you take Enoch out. We hear about the war in heaven and a third of the angels falling in the beginning, and then we hear about this war in the Book of Revelations, and that timeline gets a little weird by the Book of Revelations. And common theory is that Revelations really, by John the Evangelist, was a threatening letter that he wrote to the 7 heads of state when he was exiled. That really probably did not fit with canon, but was put in there because, well, they needed the book to have a good ending, essentially. But it creates some timeline problems. Enoch does solve those timeline problems in a very real sense of the word, but it creates kind of some other issues with catechism and dogma. And it's easier to have some questions that people rarely ask because, like you say, a lot of this stuff gets cherry picked than to have to explain away all of this stuff about angels becoming watchers and that sort of thing, and having to explain away that Jesus was an angel, which is also mentioned in Enoch, which means that the fall of man was preordained, that God knew about the deluge before he even created man. It's some really interesting stuff, but you're right, it makes canon very, very complicated. You weren't allowed on the ark? Well, that's sad. I'm sorry. Well, the unicorns didn't want to go, so I guess issue with the unicorns. Power of the Weirdos for sure, Dovey. I'm so glad. Hi, Megan. Oh, look at you. You came in the end. Well, you'll have to watch it on the page. Part of wine, part of water is walking, secret transforming. They call those miracles. I call those magic, and I think Debbie, you've got a valid point there. There is magic in every religion, and it's something that we talk about on the page. But whether it is turning water into wine because Jesus was at a wedding and there didn't happen to be any wine, or whether it's John Smith reading magical rocks, or whether it is Helios pulling the sun across the sky, no matter what religion we're looking at, there is magic in it. And whether we want, even in modern religions, there's magic. That when we talked about Catholicism today, when the priest stands up in front of his church and turns a cracker into the body of Christ, that is a very magical act, is it not? Regardless of what we call it, magic is in the world all around us. It is, which I think makes it all the more important that we look at this Book of Enoch and specifically how magic is differentiated from miracles. Because miracles are performed by men, and they were taught to us by more with the blessing of God. Whereas we're talking about in the Book of Enoch things like sorcery, alchemy, knowledge of plants. All of that was taught to us without the consent of God. That was taught to us by these fallen angels who didn't ask permission, who just came down and taught people things that they were already trying to learn, but gave us this forbidden knowledge. And therefore it is magic. So there's a very clear differentiation that magic is bad and miracles are good, and that is solely based on, one, who taught it to us and whether or not it was taught to us with the blessing of God, and two, how it's passed down. Miracles are continued to be performed by every single priest because they are passed down through the church. They are taught through the church. They're performed through the church. Whereas magic, as we just discussed in the Book of Enoch, is passed down through genetic coding. That was given to us by angels without God's consent. And that makes it a very, very different thing. And it's really a topic that we could explore ad nauseum. But it is very, very interesting, and it probably is very much the beginning of witches kind of being put into this demonized bubble, really from as soon as we're hearing that word being cited inside of these specific religions. We didn't hear theurgists in ancient Greece saying that the miracles of Artemis and Demeter were evil because they didn't have that concept of evil. They had the concept of demones, which is where we get the word demon. But those gods were not inherently evil. They weren't inherently good either. They were very ambiguous, much like men were. I feel like I've talked quite a lot. Do we have any more questions? Well, hey, look at me. I did this without a camera crew. Wasn't quite a shit show as I thought it would be. Well, like it. Let me know if you liked the video. Let me know if there's more you want to hear. I know we've been talking about doing a video on the Neolithic era and Ketel-Hayok, and the origin of the hermaphroditic gods during the advent of agriculture. So once I get some research done on that, maybe I'll write some cue cards up. But otherwise, I welcome your recommendations, and I thank all you guys for coming. I thank you for all your likes and shares. I hope you have a wonderful night. I know it's getting late. All right. Thanks so much. Thanks for coming to the Memebrary, and I will see you guys on the page.